Welcome everyone to our second annual James Wilson Lecture in Law and Government. James Wilson was one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, but was born in Leven in Fife.
He's stealing all of my lines. That's my speech.
And like our speaker today, was a student at the University of St Andrews. Our annual lecture in his name looks at issues in law and government that would have been of interest to him. We're delighted this year to welcome Susan Page to give the lecture. Susan D. Page is Professor of Practice in International Diplomacy at the Ford School of the University of Michigan and Professor from Practice at the University of Michigan Law School. Susan was the first US Ambassador to the Republic of South Sudan and served as Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations in Haiti, among other senior diplomatic roles. As Ambassador to newly independent South Sudan from 2011 to 2014, Susan played a crucial role in navigating the instability and eventual eruption of civil war in the country and providing foreign policy options for change. She's received numerous top State Department awards for her service, including the Sue M. Cobb Award for Exemplary Diplomatic Service, the Commendation for Outstanding Service to the Sudan Peace Process, and the Meritorious Honor Award for outstanding efforts in the promotions of the rule of law, human rights and peace in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And tonight she will be talking to us on the title, Never-Ending Wars, Who Decides? Susan.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. I'm extremely pleased to return to St Andrews, where I spent my final undergraduate year some 1,000 years ago or so, and where I made lifelong friends. First of all, thank you guys for being here, and it's a pleasure to be back and be back on my old stomping grounds. I'm also honored to give this year's James Wilson Law and Government Lecture. I have to admit, I had to change everything that I was going to talk about, and I felt that while the title was still appropriate, it was a very different kind of war that I needed to talk about and address today. So I just want to say at the outset, this is not my area of specialty, but I will try to at least make a little bit of sense of what's going on. John mentioned at the beginning, legal historians across the pond, i.e. in my neck of the woods, know James Wilson as one of the founding fathers of the United States. He was elected twice to the Continental Congress, and he was a signatory of the United States Declaration of Independence. He was also a major participant in drafting of the US Constitution. He was also one of the first of the justices named to the US Supreme Court. I think I studied here a long time ago. That was in 1789. So, as has already been said, James Wilson was born right here in Fife. Most Americans don't know that, but I would say, having gone through law school in the United States, I don't remember ever learning about James Wilson as a lawyer. So I think in the US, I'm in good company not knowing so much about him. Not so true here from all of the conversations that we've had this weekend about law and constitutionalism. What was not mentioned, but I will just briefly say about James Wilson, is that although he did study at St Andrews, he also studied at Glasgow and Edinburgh, and didn't receive a degree from any of the three. So, as I said, when I chose the title of my lecture, Never-Ending Wars, Who Decides?, Russia wasn't really on my mind, and this was planned quite some time ago. And I intended to speak about the long wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, the difficulty of ending wars, how do you get out, who decides that it's time to leave. But with Russia's fuller invasion of Ukraine in the last few days, I couldn't help but talk about about the current events. So I thought that the image on the poster for today's talk says so much about what we are witnessing right now, a chessboard with only one player left standing. So what is the objective of the game of chess? To checkmate, i.e. to threaten with an inescapable capture the opponent's king. So how you get there, how you win, depends on the moves you make and the tactics and the strategy that you employ to topple your opponent. So we talk of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia in ways that obscure a little bit of what's happened over the course of the past 20, if not much, much longer, and certainly even of the past few years alone. And I wanted to say that past history actually does matter, and it matters more so when the lives of so many people are at risk. So I'm not a Russian or European expert, so I don't want to stray too far into uncharted territory, lest you think that St. Andrews made a mistake in letting me in here. But let me mention a few things that I believe are important that might help us understand how we got here, because it's important to understand the viewpoint from your opponent or from the other in order to understand how you behave. So not that long ago, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright said of the US, "We are an indispensable nation." Her words fit our self-image and our beliefs about ourselves as a people and as a nation, at least at that time. And I want to stress that, at that time. But we've seen a lot of things in the last few years alone that have made us question, or at least made some of us question, exactly what it is that we stand for, even domestically, let alone overseas. So does that self-image reflect the way in which other nations view us? So as noted by Jonathan Masters in a January 20th article published by the Council on Foreign Relations, Russian leaders have watched with mounting resentment as the transatlantic alliance of NATO has nearly doubled its membership since the end of the Cold War. Russian leaders have long been annoyed with the eastward expansion of NATO, particularly as the alliance opened its doors to former Warsaw Pact states and ex-Soviet republics in the late 1990s, including the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland, and in the early 2000s, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. Now, back in 2008, and I'm sure Stephen will make sure I get all the dates right, but back in 2008, President Vladimir Putin warned the US that no Russian leader could stand idly by in the face of steps toward NATO membership for Ukraine. That was in 2008. He said that would be a hostile act toward Russia. According to Masters, NATO did not announce a formal membership plan for Ukraine and Georgia at that 2008 Bucharest summit, but it did affirm that, quote, "these countries will become members of NATO." And it extended formal invitations to accession talks to Albania and Croatia, which then became members in 2009, so just a little over a year later. NATO membership expanded again in 2017, admitting Montenegro, and in 2020, welcoming North Macedonia. According to many analysts, NATO's expansion left deep scars on the Russian psyche, saying that the 1990s were a decade of humiliation for Putin in particular, as the United States imposed its vision of order on Europe, including in Kosovo in 1999. While the Russians could do nothing but, quote, "stand by and watch," wrote James Goldgatter for War on the Rocks. For Putin, NATO's expansion was not about ensuring the security of Europe or modernization of the alliance to confront the challenges of the day, terrorism, the war in Afghanistan. Rather, its enlargement was seen as a serious provocation that reduced mutual trust between the US-led NATO and Russia, as many new members, particularly the Baltic state countries, saw NATO membership as a shield against their former Soviet rulers. Putin drew a red line on Ukraine. In the summer following NATO's 2008 Bucharest summit, where NATO stated its intent to admit Georgia and Ukraine, Russia invaded the former. They invaded Georgia. Despite raising its concerns and diplomatic efforts aimed at arms control and various strategic partnerships with and between NATO states and Russia, ostensibly to boost mutual trust, President Putin watched and observed. The US no longer seemed like Madeleine Albright's indispensable nation, and Western powers were faced with numerous internal issues and a new type of strategic threat. NATO was no longer as united as once believed. So what happened? In 2014, Ukraine began inching closer to a new partnership, not just a military partnership with NATO, but with a Western economic bloc, the European Union. Possibly in an effort to stop NATO and Western European expansion into areas long considered of strategic importance to Russia, and few lasting consequences to Russia from its invasion of Georgia, Russia decided to invade Ukraine and annex Crimea. Actions and reactions have consequences, as we know, but history matters. And if working on conflict resolution and peace agreements has taught me anything, it is that history matters. And the history we need to understand is not just how we view an issue, but in this case, how Russia views its strategic interests and how it seeks to play its own role in this new world order based on that history and that view. So if we think about this continuation, we're currently talking about the invasion of Ukraine as if Crimea didn't happen, as if 2014 didn't happen, and this is new. I mean, it's horrible and it's newly inflamed, but they were already there. Why were they still there? What happened? Why was nothing more done? So on August 20th, 2012, so 2 years before he invaded Ukraine and took over Crimea, President Obama also used the phrase red line, but he used it in relationship to the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian civil war, saying, and I'm quoting this, "We have been very clear to the Assad regime, but also to other players on the ground, that a red line for us is if we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons." So while disagreements between nations could not be breached, and even a joint resolution of the United States Senate authorizing the president to use very limited military force in the Syrian civil war, that resolution never even received a floor vote in either the House or the Senate. So Russia's intervention in Syria after the so-called red line had been crossed, according to many analysts, was undertaken as a relatively low-risk project once the Kremlin was assured that the United States would not intervene and topple the regime of Bashar al-Assad. So the old world order was indeed changing when the world failed to stand together against chemical weapons used by the Syrian regime against its own people in a war that continues with devastating effect to this day. But please don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to justify Russia's occupation of and annexation of Crimea in 2014, its devastating invasion of Ukraine, or its most recent declaration of so-called independence of 2 of Ukraine's territories. No. But rather than calling Putin crazy or saying that he's lost his marbles, we must at least try to understand the situation as Putin and the Russian government saw it before this invasion. And that's where history is important. We can't believe that only our own actions are rational. We have to at least try to see things as the other views them. And that's how chess works. We have to ultimately defeat our opponent by a checkmate, by looking at their strategy and how they act. One of my own disappointments, I would say, is that sometimes in working on peace negotiations or in conflict-ridden countries, I didn't really understand the importance of the past, but also the sociological or anthropological reasons that people in conflict act. And each country, each context, each individual, it can be clan, it can be family, it can be caste, it can be lots of different things depending on the place. But they all are doing things in a way that is based on some part of their history or the past. So like in South Sudan, for instance, had I known that the Murle tribe, one particular tribe in South Sudan, that they fight alongside with their age mates, so the same guys, boys to men, that all went through an initiation process at the same time. So they're not literally their age mates, but they're set, their class. They competed with the other set, with the other age mates, internally for power to be the best, as well as fighting with the ostensible opponent. If I'd known some of those things, it might have been more useful in at least addressing some of the approaches to resolving some of the conflict in a different way. I want to give one more example because I think this one is particularly telling to my way of thinking. That when I was still a comment about South Sudan, but when I learned that a particular tribe abducts women and children and takes them in to their own clan and to their family, I, of course, sought to find a reason. I mean, how traumatic that must be for the kidnapped person, how traumatic it must be for the family who's now lost a woman, child, wife, son, daughter. But I then started doing some research, and I was lucky enough that we had anthropologists and historians who were sort of had done some papers for the State Department and the Embassy and USAID. And I learned that there was very low fertility rates. And one of the ways to continue to multiply is you need to have new people to, I don't want to sound really silly, but to mate with. And they didn't. But I think what happens is we get stuck in the argument about why do they have low fertility rates? Is it because they have had too much inbreeding? Is it because of some disease that is attacking them? Is it because of all of these different things? As opposed to, okay, what purpose does this abduction serve? So it served a purpose, which was we are going to die out. And every group wants to make sure that it continues. Now, we don't like the action, the kidnapping, the taking of someone else, but I also learned that even with that trauma, once that child is in the new family and in the tribe, they are treated just like everyone else. They are fully integrated, they are welcomed, they are considered a son or daughter, just like everyone else, even though biologically they aren't. So you have to think about the different reasons why people are doing this, and even if you stop the bad practice, the kidnapping, the pain and agony that goes along with that, what do you put in its place in order to make sure that that group can continue to flourish and that the positive attributes, the treatment as family, as love, as warmth, that part continues. So again, some of the things that I learned, I would have loved to have learned even before I went out to South Sudan, or even when I was working on the peace agreement for Sudan, which had all of these same groups, to find out not just that they're a collection of one army or several militias, but they're a collection of people with histories and backgrounds and habits. So again, I think that it might have been more useful if I was able to put some of this information to use earlier. So now, I will say, I'm glad to see that NATO, the EU, and many other countries are finally uniting to impose economic and other measures against the Kremlin's vast war chest. These measures are strong, but not all of them will have immediate effect. and some of the banking and other economic sanctions will not affect all of Russia's financial system. Germany has finally agreed to cancel the energy pipeline with Russia, Nord Stream 2. Again, good sign. A lot of countries have stepped up to provide military weapons and humanitarian assistance. But I also heard an interview yesterday morning with a woman who said, we need things, yes, and we are happy that people are providing us with items. But what we need is not used clothes, not secondhand clothes. I mean, so even the tools that we use are often very ill-fitting for the crisis that we're suffering. But now that the world has more or less united, how are they going to get this military equipment in now that Russia is already in certain parts and is bombing certainly the second city, and apparently the tanks are rolling down the streets of Kyiv, from what I understand. So on Friday, the U.S. put forward a U.S. draft UN security resolution that would have deplored in the strongest terms, this is the language, that would have deplored in the strongest terms the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine. China, India, and the United Arab Emirates all abstained, but of course, Russia used its power to veto the Security Council resolution. But on Sunday, the Security Council called for an emergency session of the 193-member UN General Assembly over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Discussions began yesterday, and the General Assembly is expected to vote this week on language that's pretty similar to the Security Council resolution, deploring Russian aggression against Ukraine and demanding Russian troops stop fighting and withdraw. Well, General Assembly votes are not binding, but on the positive side, no country, not even Security Council members, has a veto in the General Assembly. It does need 2/3 support to be adopted, but again, according to insiders, the resolution already has a number of co-sponsors, and people seem to be pretty assured that it will be adopted. So even though the General Assembly resolution is advisory, the General Assembly has only been called upon some 10 times in the past to carry this kind of political heft. And it does carry weight. Sometimes just that action alone demonstrates that the world is united and allied against Russia and intends to isolate the country. Other hopeful signs that I've seen and that we're seeing around the world are the number of protests and marches against Russia. I know that there was a vigil just at Sally's chapel. I still call it Sally's. I don't know what you guys call it now. Do people really say St. Salvatore's? Some, yes. Okay. Well, it's Sally's to me. You know, watching people with candles here, while I'm here, watching videos all over the world, including outside of Georgia and Belarus, people actually standing in unity with Ukrainian people. I think that's really, really great. And we're seeing a lot more of this sort of people power over the last several years, from Black Lives Matter's protests, which then expanded into Black Lives Matter overseas, about other things that weren't necessarily about Black lives, but about serious human rights violations, or the disastrous police in Nigeria, the SARS police unit. We see right now the resistance committees in the Sudan calling for an end to military rule. Did you see how I did that? I went back into the countries that I'm So in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the alleged killing of civilians, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court announced yesterday his decision to proceed with the opening of an investigation into the situation in Ukraine as quickly as possible. I see these as very positive steps, even if they will not have effect immediately and may only be something that results in survivors or victims, which are sometimes used interchangeably and that I don't like. But I think that's where we see some of this coming together, and that might energize other states and individuals. And it might also put pressure on the states that are resisting that kind of change, including my own government, which is rolling back rights to vote and things that we thought we no longer had to think about, that we thought we were able to take for granted as this is done. So I hope that this echoing of concern, and even the fact that the ICC prosecutor, the ICC has been accused numerous times of targeting Africans for crimes against humanity, war crimes, because almost all of the situations that have been investigated are in Africa. And the power politics that go with being a Security Council member, because there are only a few ways that a situation, which is kind of loosely a country, but it could be a part of a country, can go before the ICC. And one of those ways is the UN Security Council through a resolution, even if that state is not a member, a state party to the International Criminal Court. And that's important because it has been used, or it has been supposed to have been used in cases where the US, which is not a state party to the Rome Statute, the ICC, has initiated, or other states have initiated actions against individuals, or in a situation where that country is maybe not a member state, or because it's the only way that the US can bring in a country against, to go before the ICC. Now, the one difference with the International Criminal Court is that the prosecutor, on his or her own initiative, can also initiate a prosecution, an investigation, sorry. And then it has to go before the trial chamber, the pretrial chamber, to determine if they actually have jurisdiction. But that's what he's done in this case, because Ukraine is not a state party to the ICC, but they have indicated on several occasions their willingness to accept ICC jurisdiction, but have not yet had time to go through the process to ratify, to adopt and ratify the treaty. And that's important because that is another element for which Ukraine has some ability to call the world's attention, because the Rome Statute is designed as crimes that are of the most significant international threat to peace and security, the worst kinds of crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and then more recently, the crime of aggression was added and has now received enough votes to be included as well. So the prosecutor's statement, though, also talks about the fact that he's calling on other states to refer the situation of Ukraine or of Russia, because other states' parties, so again, doesn't have to be a UN Security Council resolution. A state can put forward a situation, and then it still will go through the process to look at the alleged crimes and see if there is a reasonable basis to proceed with opening an investigation. So I'm just going to quote this last bit, but he says, in particular, I am satisfied that there is a reasonable basis to believe that both alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed in Ukraine, in relation to the events already assessed during the preliminary examination by the office. Given the expansion of the conflict in recent days, it is my intention that this investigation will also encompass any new alleged crimes falling within the jurisdiction of my office that are committed by any party to the conflict on any part of the territory of Ukraine. I think that's really significant. And in asking other states, he's calling on them, now's your time. If you claim that this treaty is so important, and that even with alliances and whatnot, they've finally started breaking down the doors. And unlike the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court looks at individual crimes, not crimes committed by the state. So it's the actors of a state, which can include anyone who is accused of these crimes, crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, or the act of aggression. So he's called out on member states to further expedite matters so that it would be for an ICC state party to refer the situation to my office. And I ask you all to ask your states to refer the issue. I mean, I've heard your Prime Minister's statements calling Putin's actions and the Russian Federation's actions barbaric. And this is some of the same language that was used in Libya, and which triggered for the first time in Libya a Security Council resolution recognizing the responsibility to protect. So even if your state is not protecting its own citizens, the international community more broadly has a responsibility to protect individuals. So I'm going to close by saying I hope you'll ask questions, and I thank you all for listening. I really hope that this stops before long, and I will say that, you know, advocacy takes on many, many forms. And when people stand together, it's a lot harder for states to continue to deny people their rights. And, you know, that old saying that, you know, first they came forward, you can fill in the blank of whichever group, but I said nothing because I was not of that group. Then they came for another group and I said nothing because I was not from that group. Then they came for me and I was of that group and there was no one left to say anything. So advocate, there are lots of ways to do it. Some people do it with the pen and write letters and call upon their governments. Some people protest, some people walk in the streets. Lots of different ways to do so. So if you are interested in these kinds of events that affect us all, you don't have to have a Ukrainian friend or a Russian friend to care. Our world is super global and super interconnected. So I would ask you to do what you can, inform yourselves. You know, I mean, there's a lot out there. Be prudent about what you read because not everything is true. And we know that states that are more authoritarian, you only have one source and that's the government. But be wise and analyze what sources are more accurate than others and do your part and encourage others to do the same. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. That was wonderful. And as Susan says, plenty of time for questions.
My name's Allison Sidgers. I'm a postgrad student in international political theory, and I'm from Washington State. So I was wondering, you mentioned kind of as an aside about definitionally like survivor versus victim. I was wondering if you could expand on that and explain what you meant.
Yeah, so in particular, the International Criminal Court has a portion of funding and responsibility of the court are the victims. They actually call them victims. And there's been kind of a big shift. I mean, we have to remember, you know, the statute was written in 2002. And so, well, it was actually written earlier than that, but it was finally ratified, came into force in 2002. So, you know, in that time period, in that 20 years, people have changed quite a lot, their views on victimhood. And I personally am never quite comfortable, but that's the language, you know, as a lawyer, well, that's the language that they use, but I try to broaden it a little bit. Not everybody is, I think sometimes, I mean, there's a lot of political theory on this, which I'm not a theorist, but about victimizing people. And even with humanitarian intervention, we're going in to save people, which is partly true, but it's as if it's taking away their own agency in doing something for themselves. Not, you know, they can't necessarily go fight this warlord or something, but I think we need to be careful about that. And some people might want to call themselves victims. I don't have a problem with that, but I don't feel like it's for me to call them that. But in terms of the actual language of the statute, it's the victims fund, it's the victims lawyers who are representing the victims representatives, et cetera. So it's just makes me uncomfortable every time I look at it.
Thank you.
Alex?
Greetings. I'm Alexander Prom. I am a postgrad student as well in the legal and constitutional studies, and I'm from Minnesota. And so I was just wondering, so you were talking about how people everywhere have kind of stood with the Ukrainians. And we've also seen that the Russian people themselves are largely standing with the Ukrainian people, with some of the largest protests Moscow has seen since the fall of the USSR. However, people are still like standing against their nation as a whole and punishing the people with sanctions. So how, in your experience as an ambassador, would that misconception possibly be resolved?
Yeah, so there are different kinds of sanctions. And I mean, there are lots of studies about, do sanctions work? Who do they target most? Who's really affected? And there's also a lot of misunderstanding, even with the sanctions that maybe are really quite targeted and limited to a particular sector. Because banks don't want to run the risk of getting it wrong. And so sometimes they are overly broad in their interpretation. So as an example, Zimbabwe has sanctions on it under a particular kind of sanction, but it's not on the entire country. It's on certain industries and certain people. But sometimes the banks are like, oh, well, we can't deal with Zimbabwe, it has Zimbabwe in it. Same was true with Sudan, although Sudan was a different story because they actually really weren't fully sanctioned. There are carve-outs, and this is one of the problems with a lot of things. You can carve out a sector, but that might be the exact sector that is benefiting the elite. Even though it might benefit to a certain degree the population, but if they're already cut out of getting things, including maybe fuel, then maybe that's not the best carve out. On the other hand, well, we don't want to see our own gas prices going up. And it's wintertime, and it's cold in Europe, and it's snowing, and we don't want everybody to suffer from the lack of fuel. So it's hard. It's a hard balancing act. I'm not, you know, all of my years in the State Department, I mean, you know, I wasn't always an ambassador. I actually had to get there somehow. And, you know, we're the ones who were doing the work, the analysis. You know, I started off in the Office of the Legal Advisor in the State Department. That's what we do. Okay, well, who is this going to affect? You have the Department of Treasury, which is involved, so lots of different kinds. And I don't have a great answer for you, that there are different states that use different tools, and then the political, oh, well, the US government and Sudan right now is a perfect example. The US has not declared that it was a coup at the end of November in Sudan, and there's a statute that if they declare it to be a coup, all of these things have to happen or cannot happen. But guess what? If it's not a coup, you can carry on. And I'd be lying if I didn't say that the law is also politics, right? So what was popular today is maybe not popular tomorrow, and it seems that right now, well, okay, what happened in Chad? Not a coup. Okay, but what happened in, Senegal? Coup. They look like the same situation, but two different either legal or political determinations. If I go back further than that, I was posted to Nairobi as a regional lawyer during the time of the genocide in Rwanda. And I covered Rwanda, Burundi, for the two countries where the presidents were both killed, sparking the genocide in Rwanda, but also lots of killing in Burundi, which we just didn't talk about. Initially, the State Department's conclusion was that acts of genocide, at first it was, this is a hard determination, but then eventually it became acts of genocide, and then later, of course, we overcorrected. Similarly, Darfur, we determined it was genocide, but you could probably make the same argument about a lot of countries that are actually called, internal conflict or, things like that. So it's not so much a definitional problem, because with genocide, you have to have specific intent to destroy, in whole or in part, et cetera, et cetera. But an interpretive one that might be interpreted in one way for a certain circumstance.
Poppy?
Hi, I'm Poppy. I'm doing a Master's in Legal and Constitutional Studies. Thank you so much for the talk tonight, really interesting. I noticed your reference to anthropological research in your work. And I was interested to see what you think the future of anthropological research is in your area, in as much that, on the one hand, we're more sort of globally unified than ever before, but anthropological research also stresses difference, as you mentioned, in culture and history, and I was wondering what you think sort of the future for that area is in Tennessee.
As we talk about sort of ethnographic importance and stuff, I think it still remains largely in the realm of research. And historians use it if you're telling your own story, writing about a particular group, country, sector. Excuse me, that's when I find it to be used the most. I have very seldom seen it used professionally by conflict resolution people, which I would really like to see more of. But part of the problem is that the people doing conflict resolution are usually at this very high level because we want them to have authority and recognition that, okay, you're dealing with another sovereign state usually, and if it's someone that is just, a Susan Page, well, who do I know that might be willing to, make some compromises or be informative or whatnot? So it tends to be statesmen, former statesmen and women, UN special representatives, things like that. And I would say on the whole, like even in my time as like a political officer, time to read this stuff unless it's provided for you kind of in your packet of briefings before you go out. And with so many issues of the day, even though you are being trained and briefed on a specific country or region, that's not necessarily what people think about, because we often think, well, but our way is the way. So we need to know, I mean, it's not something that people walk around, oh, our way is the right way. But we're not even really encouraged to do that. I mean, again, I'll just go back to the US for now. Oh, we can't, and I know it's a moment, but it's a serious, serious moment where we don't want to teach history. We want to, it's not just that it is dealing with, Black people, Native people, whatever. It is part of our history. And so, like when January 6th attack on the Capitol happened, the first comments were, this is not who we are. Yeah, it is who we are. It's not all that we are, though. And that's the part that we are such binary creatures. At least, again, I'm just speaking from the perspective of a former American diplomat, analyst, whatever you want to call it. It's the Sudanese are the bad guys, the SPLM, SPLA are the good guys. How'd that work out? But we're unable to kind of flip when the reality starts sinking in. And in many ways, that's kind of the whole problem with war. We might have a great reason for going in, whatever the reason is. Let's say it's well-reasoned, well thought out. But you launch a war to attack militarily your enemy. But what do you do now that the enemy has basically been defeated? Now you don't know what to do, because you don't really have, like, the war has a purpose that is this victory. But what happens after? So I would love to see more of that, because I think we would be much more effective diplomats if we understood more about the cultural norms, and some places do it much better than others. I don't know that the US does it particularly well. Some stuff is just my own curiosity that I learn these things, and not turning my nose up when I have been confronted with something that would certainly not be what I would eat at home, but would be extremely rude not to eat, or at least attempt, unless maybe you have a religious reason or something medical, whatever. But a lot of people, they've kind of forgotten those sort of old school tactics. In a lot of parts of the world, are really important. And you see that in the language that's used. So in South Asia, in the local language where rice is your main dish, you ask people not, hey, how's it going? You ask them, have you eaten rice today? That's the greeting. Doesn't that tell you a lot? Mm-hmm. But we don't get to know that. We might learn it as a greeting, but we're not helped to put the pieces together. That why do we think this moved into the lexicon of place X? And if that food is not eaten, or the fact that in lots of countries around the world, people eat with their hands, and it's not because they're not civilized, but they also feel as if when they eat that same food, but with a fork, it doesn't taste as good. It's not the same. But like to us, that would just like, what are you talking about? It's cooked exactly, looking ridiculous. But it's, it's a different kind of approach. So I don't know, and I wish that decision makers, policy makers actually had time to think about this kind of research and these sorts of issues.
Question there.
Hi, Matt, doing IR. No, I was just interested to hear about what your experience in the Horn and actually looking at a slightly different country, Ethiopia, and the kind of current horrible situation there. And I wanted to kind of hear your thoughts about the failure of the international community to kind of call out what seems to be a pretty clear definition of genocide or what's occurring in Tigray.
So I spent a year as our chargé to the African Union at the end of my career. And I think we've made a lot of mistakes. And I mean, collectively, but certainly on the United States side. And even when you look at, again, I mean, I go back to this sort of good guys, bad guys. And there just so rarely is there, you know, the gray areas where you can be good at things and not so good at things. But how do you also call things out diplomatically, appropriately, not get kicked out of the country, which has happened to me in Haiti, and also, you know, be true to yourself and what you see. As an example, we put a lot of stock in Mellish, and had very senior diplomats who went to his funeral, and he was a strategist. He was, you know, but you can be brilliant and still be brutal. But these senior U.S. statespeople went and practically gave the eulogy. Well, a eulogy is not about bad things about the person. It's all of these wonderful attributes. You have to be really careful with that. People don't forget. We think that that's, you know, that was the past. People have really long memories when, you know, he was not universally beloved at home. They struck a balance and a compromise with this federal ethnic federalism, and it was starting to see real, you know, areas, but we never called anything, yeah, I mean, not nothing, but we were not taking the same kind of approach to Mellish as we are now taking to Abiy. And then you have the internal disputes. And we also have this division within the US government of sub-Saharan Africa, and all of North Africa is in a completely different bureau. So most of it is in Near Eastern affairs. So you have Ethiopia, your Africa hands are working on Ethiopia because it's in Africa, it's in the Africa Bureau. But who's involved? The Russians, UAE, Egypt, Saudi, Kuwait. I mean, you've got all these others, and it's difficult to navigate because their priorities are different depending on where you're looking at it from. So if you're Egypt, they might not care at all about the fighting. You fight your Tigray, but don't touch the Nile waters. That's what they care about. But that's in a different bureau. So, you know, we need like a reordering of the world order, which of course lots of states have been calling on for, you know, decades, but that's not happening. So there have been calls saying that it is genocide. Actually, Tony Blinken has said that, and so it's on the record. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's being handled very well. So I know that's not a great answer.
No, thank you. It's very interesting.
And there's a lot of competition. I mean, the State Department is competing over, who should have the say. For the first time, they've appointed a special envoy for the Horn of Africa, which I'm not a fan of special envoys because people don't know, well, who's in charge, is it the resident ambassador? Yes. Or is it this special envoy who maybe has a personal relationship with the secretary or the president or whatever, which is also good and important. But I did think that the appointment of Jeffrey Feltman, who has a great, had a great career, for those of you who don't know what a Rolodex is, but your contact list in your iPhone, but a massive contact list and database of people throughout North Africa, but mostly in the Middle East, which is where his career focused. But he also then spent, 10 years at the UN as the head of political affairs. So he knows everybody. I was like, okay, that's good. And his deputy knew Africa. But then he resigned. We know that there were some internal things that, to his credit, he doesn't really want to publicize, but stuff gets out. And internal wrangling about who should be in charge, again, Special Envoy's office, Africa, Assistant Secretary, where does NEA fit in, Security Council, inside the US, the National Security Advisor, it's just, but then there's no looking at what were the reasons that he stated. It doesn't have to be public. It can be off the record, one-on-one. And what do? They hire another person with the same kind of background, but none of those same contacts. It's like, how does that make sense? So I find it very disappointing. I'd say the same thing on Haiti. The Haiti special envoy appointed by them themselves. It's not like, oh, well, this was the guy from the last administration. No, they appointed both of these people, and he resigns. His was much more public, and I'm glad that he continues to speak out, but absolutely no pivot. They just go deeper into the same stuff, which is what a lot of these people are resigning for. I don't think we're in a very good place, in case you couldn't tell.
Another question, relating to the U.S. and what you see as the future. In your answer to Poppy, you kind of talked about what's going on in the U.S. with an unwillingness to teach about our history and any parts that might be ugly. Do you see
that might make people feel bad?
Yeah.
Feel uncomfortable. I think that's what it says.
What do you see as the results if, I come from an area where the school board is very contested right now with these questions, and I'm concerned about a future where a lot of students that came right after me are not learning the same things about the world they live in that I learned. And I wonder what that's going to mean for places like the State Department and other departments in the US government when they then turn outside of the US and their view, which is already very America-centric, is also full of huge gaps. What do you see as possible solutions and things that we should be looking out for in the future to try and warn against if we're in positions in the State Department or in our local school districts to try and prevent that from occurring?
That's a hard one, because I don't actually think our education was very good. On history. And I'm just thinking back to my own education. I went to a fantastic public school, public in the US sense, but upper middle class neighborhood, so there's money and resources and all of that. And slavery is not the only thing that happened to Black people. We didn't talk about Columbus. Columbus didn't discover America. You go through your whole primary school, high school, university, it wasn't until much later, not so much that I didn't know it, but it certainly wasn't taught. And it was through protest movements and people calling for, no, we don't want this Columbus Day, we don't want statues. Do you want to know what Native people think about Columbus Day? So it took that kind of thing. If I think about really before my time, but at the universities where they wanted Chicano studies, Latin American studies, Mexican studies, Black or African American studies, it wasn't there. They protested for that to happen. So, it's sort of partly the demands that are made and people being willing to sacrifice. And not everybody is, even when they believe that things need to change. And that's a personal, that's a personal decision. But if we just go back to the old way, I mean, people, when desegregation happened, people found their workaround. That's how we got so many private schools. Okay, I'll start my own school. Well, now what happened a few years later? Might not have been for the same purpose. Now we'll create charter schools. They're not quite private schools. They're not quite regulated by the public schools. They're a little bit hybrid. Now we have very active, boards of education. I think a lot of it is at the state level and kind of going back almost to the states' rights question that, again, I think a lot of people felt was more or less settled, and but we focus a lot at the federal level, but that's actually not where most of our laws are either made or enforced. If you get into the system, you get into it at the state level, generally speaking. And if you can't teach about bias, you can't teach about history, you can't, you can only, but it's also that, again, going back to the ethnographic studies, if you don't even know that that's a thing, well, I don't expect you to know what my experience has been, because you're not me. But I expect you to have at least some curiosity or enough so that when I tell you something, you don't say, no, that didn't happen. Excuse me? How do you know that didn't happen? That was my experience. And that's a big part of the problem, is that, no, it couldn't have happened. You couldn't possibly have experienced this thing, but you did. So I'm really worried. I mean, I'm really, really worried. And the only thing I can think of, honestly, is people have to step up, but it's tiring. It's really, really exhausting. It's exhausting to walk around every day and, okay, well, if I'm in this location, I'm standing outside, I'm in Wimbledon, I'm a Black woman. I don't think I'm particularly scary, but I also have the experience of the US. Might not at all apply in the same way here. But I wouldn't know that unless I had an experience here or someone else had an experience here that could, that I could believe and help to try to navigate that. So, yeah, I just think that it's what is truth and propaganda and everything. People really believe a lot of this stuff. I don't know if it's a sign of the times that people want something that they just have to hold on to, and we can't divert.
Erin?
Hi, I'm Erin. I'm on the Legal Constitutional Studies in Lit. So I was kind of wondering about the UN. So the UN Security Council, the permanent members' veto is obviously something that's quite debated at times, and particularly just now when Russia can just go in and veto actions against themselves. And I was wondering if the UN, the general resolution is adopted, if you think that will further delegitimise the role of the permanent veto, because it's saying we don't agree with this, this should not happen, or if you think it might actually act as a way to legitimise it by saying, well, there is a fail-safe there if enough of the world supports it.
I actually think it's going to strengthen the UN Security Council, sadly. Mostly because every time one country vetoes something that we don't like that they vetoed, but then we turn around, whoever the other, one of the other five, one of the other four, they want to use it for their own purposes. And so I have a feeling that the resolution itself, if it passes the General Assembly, will be great and as a sign signaler, but it might not be great in terms of the longer term changes to the Security Council or UN apparatus. I mean, it's sad to think that at this stage, some of the really important countries are not on the Security Council. They're important by size, by population, by geography, and actually that's one of Russia's complaints. They feel like, I'm not justifying it, but they feel like they've never gotten recognition for even their actions in World War II. They did a lot of bad actions too, no question, but when people talk about the Allies, nobody mentions Russia. I think that's odd, and that goes back to history. Like, who talks about it? So, yeah, unfortunately, I think it might make it worse.
Susan, can I just follow up on that a moment? You started off when you were talking about knowledge, not so much of history, but of your opponent's view of history, helping your understanding of situations. And it made me think about conversations I had with people who are well informed about the Russian view of Russian history. And I know about the medieval history of Russia and their perception of medieval history of Russia. And we didn't think that Russia would invade Ukraine. So does knowing your opponent's view of their history help understanding what has happened, or does it help at all with predicting what they will do?
I think it can be both, but we also have to be willing to look at the lessons learned. I mean, as I was looking at these situations, I mean, I wasn't putting all of the dots together. I'm not saying that this is, but if I'm thinking, like you said, I mean, I understand these are people who do know this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. But I also don't think that we as people, we're not very good predictors of future actions. I was looking at a national security, our U.S. national security puts out a study every 10 years, but they update it like every 5 years. And their predictions were wildly inaccurate. And they talk to a ton of people. It's not just, the CIA analyst who maybe, has their tunnel vision. They're talking to academics, they're talking to sociologists, political scientists, diplomats, NGO workers. You've seen it from this perspective, all over the world. And then they do these predictions based on either region or, countries. I mean, the title of the article is what U.S. security got wrong. Do you have a follow-on?
So what you're saying is that understanding your opponent's view of their past might make your predictions less bad at best.
Okay. Yeah, but I do think it can help inform our actions, not necessarily our predictions. And I think that's different.
Hi, Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm a postgrad on the Legal and Constitutional Studies MLit. You spoke about the ICC and their response in times of war, and I was curious, the U.S. is a party to the ICC, and I was curious how you felt that that has influenced the response rate, or lack of response in situations of war in the past, and how you think it will influence their response currently.
The U.S. has changed its views of the ICC over time in many ways. So I'm not entirely sure how, let's say, this administration might look at it. But generally speaking, it's not usually, the statute wasn't really designed for during times of war. So I think the prosecutor going after an active situation at the beginning is very different. It's a very different use of, I mean, sometimes, you know, the war is still going on in Afghanistan and they open an investigation, but I have not, I mean, I'd have to think about it, but I don't recall something immediately within days of a conflict starting. I think this is the first time. So, but I will be curious to see how states react, because that didn't get very much play, the article that I read, but it was only yesterday. So it could be that as I was, you know, writing away, that all these other comments were coming in about it. But the ICC, the U.S. has been very, very wary of the ICC and of successive prosecutors, even regardless of who the prosecutor is and who's been in at least the U.S. administration. And that's partly the history of the writing with the conference, the Rome conference that developed the treaty itself. You know, an unelected prosecutor, we're afraid that's going to, you know, they could use these powers, of course, against the United States. The United States has gone out and signed all these, basically forced countries to sign these agreements that we won't take you to The Hague if something, you know, if your troops or your people do something. A couple of UN Security Council resolutions where the U.S. in particular, but other states have put in language specifically excluding non-states party citizens from that resolution. That's a bad sign.
Hey, I'm Marcel. I'm a PhD student in international relations, and before this I was at DoD, so it's interesting to hear about State Department's done. But
okay, so now we'll start on DoD.
No, go for it, by all means. But I guess right now, as it regards to Africa, Biden's tapped Judd Devermont to sort of develop a sort of. Oh, you're rolling your eyes already. Good.
I'm really a bad poker player because I'm way too transparent.
But essentially, to do an Africa strategy, and he's sort of more of a security guy, more of a FSC guy. What kind of things would you like to see from it? And I mean, based on your action, what are you expecting to see from it?
Well, I have seen Judd change a little bit since he has been at
The White House.
yeah. No, that's not where he was. He was at somewhere else.
They're all the same.
Anyway, and there, in charge of the Africa program. So, I mean, his writings have been a little bit, I would say, have been better and more inclusive. But, I mean, we need a policy. We need an actual strategy. I don't understand why you would claim that we are trying to demilitarize our foreign policy, and then you, instead of your NSC for Africa director, you go out and get the guy who was just at, the CIA. I mean, a lot of us were not very happy. I mean, I'll give some other examples. I think that we are we are giving away our Africa foreign policy to the Middle East. The people that have just been, first of all, there's no excuse in my mind that we have so many, not just that the positions themselves are vacant, there's not even a nominee. I mean, we can blame the Senate for not voting on people, for holding people up for their shenanigans, but we can't blame them if you have not nominated an ambassador to be considered for advice and consent from the Senate. And so it was, what, a month ago now, finally, after numerous panel discussions and, letters, that they finally nominated an ambassador to Sudan and an ambassador to South Sudan. Okay, so Sudan, the people toppled Bashir. Like, no one else could do this. The population. And it wasn't a political party. It wasn't led by the generals. Okay, so fine, it was vacant under Trump, even though Trump promised that would happen. They appointed their ambassador from Sudan to Washington, and for a whole year, that position stands empty after you have a very fragile situation there. No matter what, before the coup, when the agreement was signed, was this transition. I just wonder, but anyway, these two individuals that they've nominated, they have virtually no Africa experience. They are Middle East and Asia hands. I mean, this sort of Afghanistan, Asia, and the U.S. ambassador to Ethiopia just resigned a few weeks ago, and even though not yet for confirmation, but the person that they have named just, as chargé, so temporarily, but again, why are you don't need to go out and name a chargé. You're just putting someone there temporarily. But a big splashy, the Biden administration announces that it intends to send, or it will send so-and-so, because Gita Pasi has, decided to retire and move on to other opportunities. I mean, this is a career, okay, they put in another career person, at least temporarily. Again, she's been ambassador, and I don't know. No offense to some other countries, but in one of the stands. You're going to Ethiopia. Like, it's a huge, complicated country, even if it's just a chargé at a time of major crisis. And having experience in Tunisia is not the same as having experience in even a Malawi. I mean, it doesn't have to be big conflict, but that you just, who are you going to contact? Who are your, that's what you count on for these senior positions. So no, I'm not very, I'm really not happy. I mean, I've written letters about this. I think it's a really bad approach. And, in the past it was, okay, well, we'll let Africa really be the purview of France. Disastrous. France has their own policy and their own history in these countries. And you think the Ivorians like it? No. And, okay, so the Russians pull out of Mali or Senegal, now I'm getting it mixed up, and the Russians go in. I mean, they were already there, but I didn't hear us say a peep. So I don't, if they don't listen to the people that they've appointed, and again, these special envoys or, senior people who are resigning, why would you have a director for Africa and then you go out and name the John Devermont's going to be writing the Africa, like a year later, a year into your administration. I mean, sorry.
Susan, that's been wonderful. You deserve a glass of wine and then another glass of wine, I should think, for what you deserve. Let's thank Susan again, and there's wine waiting for Susan and for the rest of us.